everyone. My name is Gowtham, and I will be presenting alongside Sean and Alexandra. And our presentation is going to be about the Ukraine Russia conflict. During our presentation, you would learn a wide variety of facts, including a historical perspective between the two nations, what's going on currently, the geopolitical perspective, and a quick cultural perspective, as well as economical consequences that has taken place as a direct result of this situation. So a quick little intro. This started in the beginning of 2014, specifically February. The Russian-Ukraine war has been going on between the two countries since then. It started following Ukraine's revolution of dignity, that's when Russia decided to annex Crimea from Ukraine, which is a territory in Ukraine, and supported pro-Russian separatists in the war in Donbass against Ukrainian government forces. So fighting for the first 8 years of the conflict, it also included cyber warfare, not just armed military, which also heightened political tensions as well, naturally. In February of 2022, we did see a major escalation in the conflict between the two countries as Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So when this happened, Putin announced it was a special military operation, and that was his justification and terminology for the situation that had occurred. So, current facts about the situation. There is a lot going on, and a lot has been done. For example, ever since the 2022 February and the full-scale invasion, we have seen 15 million refugees flee from Ukraine. They have fled into neighboring countries, and I believe Canada has opened arms to about 250,000 Ukrainians to support them during this tough time. So not only that, there was also an enormous humanitarian impact as a direct result of this war. 9,940 people were killed. There is a food and shelter crisis. There is a refugee crisis. And Russia is actually currently, as we speak, occupying various areas in Ukraine. And they're basically fighting for turf. Over the period of the year, we have seen various nations and countries and leaders of those countries and nations condemned Vladimir Putin's act. There has been a few peace meetings, 3 peace meetings to be exact, generally, but they all have failed. Russia wants. Well, they have a clear goal, actually. Their goal is to conquer Ukraine, and they're not letting up. So that's why the peace meetings have failed. And people are, citizens worldwide, Russians, Ukrainians, and global leaders are actually afraid that Russia might escalate this war into with nuclear weapons, which is obviously not a good sign. This leads to my next point, the geopolitical perspective. So the invasion received widespread international condemnation from governments and international government organizations, like I have previously mentioned, with political reactions including sanctions imposed on Russia, which was supposed to trigger a widespread economic effect on Russia, and it has. We have seen their ruble and currency collapse, and the Russian central bank currently struggles to access foreign currency reserves, and the Russian government risks defaulting on dollar bonds. So the list of countries is extensive that have punished Russia for their actions. It includes USA, Canada, Switzerland, UK, EU, France, Australia, and Japan as well. So because of this, because of these sanctions, Russia is now directly working with 2 countries specifically, India and China. They give the perception that they are self-sufficient or sufficient enough with these 2 countries in transacting businesses. So when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, they account for 1/5 of all global wheat production and 70% of sunflower oil exports. So, because of this war, well, these are critical inputs for agri-food business across the world, and they could soon feel the supply crunch. So, countries neighboring or nearby, like Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, are some of the largest importers of Russian and Ukrainian food staples, and this may have an outsized impact on their populations. In fact, the rising cost of staples foods was one of the many precipitating factors that led to the Arab Springs uprising nearly a decade ago. So, one potential risk factor is more populist uprisings and protests against food price hikes in certain developing countries. So, in Ukraine, despite having many ethnic Russians with long standing connections to Moscow, broad popular support exists across the regions from the Polish border all the way to the Donbass for a European integration and a strategic outlook. As such, Ukraine may exist physically in the contested space of the heartland, but it is now ever closer in ideology, militarily, and strategically with its neighbors in the West. Putin's war in Ukraine has only accelerated this trend, causing the very threats he imagined over NATO expansion to come into fruition as Sweden and Finland are now set to join the alliance.
Be doing the historical perspective. The Kievan Rus. Both Russia and Ukraine share heritage from the Kievan Rus, the first East Slavic state. It reached its peak in the early to mid 11th century. It united Slavic and Finnic tribes and adopted Byzantine Orthodoxy in the 9th to 11th centuries. According to Old Rus chronicles, Kiev, the capital of modern Ukraine, was proclaimed the mother of Rus cities. This is an image showing the location of the Kievan Rus. This is a painting of the baptism of Kievans. This is the Rus people adopting Christianity. And this is a painting of Rurik and his brothers. Rurik was a Viking chieftain of the Rus who in 862 was invited to reign in Novgorod. He's the founder of the Rurik dynasty. Mongol invasion. After the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, the histories of the people inhabiting territories of Russia and Ukraine diverge. The Grand Duchy of Moscow united all remnants of Rus's northern provinces and evolved into the Russian state. This shows the expansion of the Mongol Empire. This is a depiction of the Battle of the Kalka River, which was a battle in 1223. This depicts the sacking of Suzdal by Batu Khan in 1238. And this is a painting of Prince Michael of Chernigov. Batu Khan ordered him to prostrate himself before the tablets of Genghis Khan. The Mongols stabbed him to death for his refusal to do so. The Cossacks. The Cossack people play an important role, so we will describe them first. They are predominantly East Slavic Orthodox Christian people originating in the steppes region of Russia and Ukraine. Historically, they were a nomadic and militarized people who, while under the nominal rule of various Eastern European states at the time, were allowed a great deal of self-governance in exchange for their military service. Millions of people still identify as ethnically Cossack. Here is a painting depicting the Cossacks writing to the Sultan of Turkey. And here is a more modern photograph of Cossack people. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth revolt Ukrainian alliance with the Russian Empire. Ukraine eventually came under the domination of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Within the Commonwealth, the militant Cossacks refused the imposition of elements of Polish culture, in particular the Polish language. Eventually, unrest amongst the Cossacks led to a rebellion against the Commonwealth, starting in 1648. The Cossacks/Ukrainians sought union with Russia, with which they had similarities in culture, language, and religion. This was formalized through the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. Here we see Sigismund III Vasa, a Polish ruler, who reigned during the peak of the Commonwealth. This is a painting of the Cossack-led uprising in Kiev, and this is the signing of the 1654 treaty between Ukraine and Russia, as depicted on a 1954 Soviet stamp. Gradual takeover. Pretty soon after the formation of this alliance, Ukraine's territory was gradually annexed by the Russian Empire and its autonomy taken away. The Cossack army was forcibly disbanded by the Russian Empire, and most Cossacks were relocated to the Kuban region in southern Russia. The Russian Empire considered Ukrainians and Belarusians ethnically Russian and referred to them as Little Russians. A perceived threat of Ukrainian separatism set in motion a set of measures aimed at the Russification of the Ukrainians. In 1804, the Ukrainian language was banned from schools as a subject and language of instruction. In 1876, Alexandra II prohibited the publication and importation of most Ukrainian language books, as well as banning all public performances and lectures in Ukrainian. This is Peter the Great in 1717. This is the Kuban region in Russia. And this is Alexander II, 1878. The Ukrainian People's Republic. The February Revolution in 1917 led to the end of the Russian Empire and led to Ukraine declaring its full independence from the Russian Republic in January 1918. The Ukrainian War of Independence lasted from 1917 to 1921 and resulted in the establishment of a Ukrainian Republic, most of which was later absorbed into the Soviet Union. And it was part of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1991. This is the flag of the UPR, which was a country from 1917 to 1920. And this is a political demonstration in Kiev, Ukraine in 1917, sparked by the February Revolution in Russia. Soviet era and Ukrainization. The end of the Russian Empire in 1917 also ended the ban on the Ukrainian language. This was followed by a period of Koreanizatsiya that promoted the cultures of the different Soviet republics. Its implementation in Ukraine was called Ukrainization. So this was a practice of increasing and promoting the usage of the Ukrainian language and promoting other elements of Ukrainian culture. All children in Ukraine were taught the Ukrainian language in school, for example. This is, of course, hammer and sickle symbol used on the flag of the USSR. And this is a 1921 Soviet recruitment poster for military education that features the Ukrainization theme. We see that the poster uses traditional Ukrainian imagery and Ukrainian language text. Holodomor. In 1932 to 1933, Ukraine experienced the Holodomor, which means the extermination by hunger in Ukraine. It was a man-made famine in Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union, that killed up to 7.5 million ethnic Ukrainians by starvation. Natural factors and bad economic policies were the primary causes of the famine, and it is widely held that the starvation of the Ukrainian peasantry was at least partly premeditated by Soviet leaders. These are photos of starved peasants on the streets of Kharkiv in 1933. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and Ukrainian independence. Ukrainian nationalism spread following Mikhail Gorbachev's political liberalization of the Soviet Union. A declaration of independence of Ukraine was passed in August 1991 as the Soviet Union dissolved. Ukraine gained its independence and inherited the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world, along with significant means of its design and production. Pictured are Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, and the change of flags moments after his resignation. And this is an image of Ukrainian independence in 1991. And that is the conclusion of the history aspect of this presentation. This roughly brings us into the modern stage of politics that we're living in now, where Russia and Ukraine are distinct nations currently at war. Here we see the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and these are images from the ongoing war.
About the economical perspective. So the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will affect the global economy via the four main channels: the financial sanctions, commodity prices, supply chain disruptions, and inflation. So as for the sanctions, the US and the EU are very cautious about sanctioning Russia because there are trade ties between Russia and the EU, and that made European policymakers reluctant to impose stringent measures on Russia. For example, Russian banks are involved in the energy trade and will not be excluded from SWIFT. The economic impact of EU and US sanctions will therefore be small outside of Russia, because if serious sanctions were to take place, Western companies that are highly exposed to Russia will be affected, and this will propagate other unwanted events. Commodity prices will also remain elevated, and as the global impact of sanctions will be limited, the EIU expects that the most serious effect of the Russia-Ukraine conflict for the world economy will come in the form of higher commodity prices. For example, Russia is a major producer of several base metals like aluminum, titanium, palladium, and nickel, all of which will jump in price as long as the conflict continues. This will have a substantial impact on the industrial sectors like the automotive industry across the globe. Supply chains will also be disrupted. For example, there are land-based trade routes between Asia and Europe, and they will be disrupted as transit through Russia becomes more difficult, and this will particularly affect Chinese companies which had increased their traffic over land-based routes through Russia en route to Europe as an alternative to sea and air freight during the COVID pandemic. So overall, higher commodity prices will fuel global inflation this year and possibly in 2023. And the EIU was already forecasting global inflation of nearly 6% this year, but now that mark is expected to be exceeded given the huge spikes in commodity prices due to this conflict. So now we're going to talk about the cultural perspective on the Russian-Ukrainian war and how it affected Ukrainians specifically. So this year, Ukrainians will not be able to enjoy these celebrations as Russia's aggression has killed and displaced innocent people, and they declared war on their culture. And since this cultural cleansing began in Crimea in 2014, the Russian army has damaged or destroyed hundreds of cultural, artistic, scientific, educational, religious institutions, sites, and works. And the Russian aggressors have looted artifacts from public and private art collections in Ukraine. And according to Ukraine officials, more than 250 cultural institutions have been damaged or destroyed. And that has included 25 artworks by Ukrainian folk art painter Maria Primachenko, which were stored in the Ivan Kiev Museum near the capital of Kiev. And the artworks are believed to have been lost when the museum was destroyed by the Russian bombing at the beginning of the invasion. And her artworks are shown on the right. So it is important to note that Russia's war is also being waged on cultural grounds, not just political or economical. So it is very important for Ukrainians to preserve their Ukrainian cultural traditions and heritage so it is not lost due to the invasion. So now we're going to talk about the influence of Russian culture on the Russian-Ukrainian war. So it is known that Putin wants to preserve Russia's culture in Ukraine, and the daily brutality of Russia's invasion has compelled many Ukrainian artists to call on the world to suspend any and all cooperation with the Russian cultural sphere for as long as the war continues. And in pre-war Ukraine, a Ukrainian citizen by the name of Svetlana Panova said in an interview that she spoke Russian without giving it much thought, but now that she lost her home to Russia twice, first being fleeing Crimea after Russia's 2014 annexation, and second, fleeing eastern Ukraine after Russia's invasion this year, that Russian language no longer feels quite right to be spoken. However, still, about 1/3 of Ukrainians have named Russian as their mother tongue, and the majority of Ukrainians say they speak it. And Russian and Ukrainian are closely related, but not enough for speakers to fully understand each other. And Ukraine was Russified for centuries under the Russian Empire and then under the Soviet Union, and that's why many Ukrainians know Russian. Yet still, interest in speaking Russian has been declining, and the Ukrainian language emerged as a cornerstone of Ukraine to push towards a strong post-Soviet self-identity. And after Russia commenced its invasion this February 24th, many began viewing the Ukrainian language as a matter of national survival. And some cities, including the capital city of Kiev, have actually began removing Russian-related monuments, makers, and road signs. And Ukraine authorities have dismantled a huge Soviet-era monument in the center of Kiev, meant to symbolize friendship between Russia and Ukraine as a response to Moscow's invasion. And this is shown in the background picture.